Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. David Greenberg, the author of John Lewis, A Life. He's written 4 books and is a professor of history, journalism, and media studies at Rutgers University. Dr. Greenberg, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. And we don't need the doctor. I mean, I am a
Oh,
PhD, but try not to put on airs.
and
So
he's humble too, folks. Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/axelbankhistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. The political party that John Lewis dedicated his professional life to just lost a decisive election to a man who Lewis had said was not legitimately elected the first time because of foreign interference. Lewis, of course, was no longer alive when the building that he worked in for so long was attacked by groups of people who prosecutors later pointed out had ties to white supremacists, the very types of groups that Lewis dedicated his entire life to combating. Now, 4 years later, the man who those groups were loyal to has won a second term in the White House, leaving many observers to wonder how much of an impact race and gender played in seeing that man defeat a woman of color. Dr. Greenberg, or David, first of all, how do you believe that John Lewis would have reacted to the second rise of Donald Trump?
well, it's a good question. I'm always wary of claiming to speak for John Lewis. For this book, studied the man for 5 years every day, reading his words, interviewing people who knew him, watching video, getting to know him about as well as I feel I could get to know anyone, even better than some people I have as real life acquaintances. But I'm still reluctant to say this is what John Lewis would think. That said, we do know what he thought of Donald Trump. That was, he said on the record, and he sort of went through an interesting evolution. When Trump first started running, he thought Trump was a demagogue, but felt that a lot of the racist rhetoric or anti-immigrant, a lot of that was demagoguery. He wasn't convinced that Trump really believed this stuff deeply. But as the presidency went on and there was an accumulation of both comments but also policies, Lewis did come to feel differently, and he did come to see a racism in Donald Trump's worldview, and also that of some of his supporters. He was careful not to kind of make the sort of deplorables kinds of mistakes. He believed that there was humanity in everyone. He believed in working with Republicans and with people with whom he disagreed. There was an incident in 2020 when some of Joe Biden's rivals that year for the Democratic nomination attacked him for having cooperated with segregationists in the Senate like James Eastland. And John Lewis said, of course, we worked with segregationists. We had to work with them. They had the power. And so I think, while he obviously would have seen Donald Trump's reelection as a blow to democracy and to the ideals that John Lewis, had fought for, he also would try to encourage people to find a way to work cooperatively, to move forward in difficult times. He used to always say things like, do not get lost in a sea of despair. Keep the faith, keep fighting the good fight. And I think that rhetoric right now will probably prove at least somewhat comforting or sustaining or inspiring to people who are looking ahead to the next 4 years as a troubling time.
Did he ever render a judgment on, did he ever make a connection between today's activism and the success of his previous activism in the context of the fact that Donald Trump became president? Did he view that as um, a window into how effective the 1960s and 1970s civil rights movements were?
Well, in a way, you could say yes. Look, John Lewis was convinced that his experiences taught him, and America's experiences showed incontrovertibly that the movements and achievements of the 1960s were hugely important, revolutionary in their implications for a fairer, freer, more democratic America. And he saw great progress from the time he was born into, dirt poor rural Alabama under the boot of Jim Crow segregation, rising to be, a beloved, revered United States congressman. And not just for him personally, of course, but for Black Americans generally. The strides, the progress, both in terms of material achievement, power in society, changing attitudes among all kinds of people, those gains were real and unmistakable. But they were always in danger of being set back. Maybe not set back all the way, back to 1940 Alabama, but set back in terms of, the Voting Rights Act being constricted and limited by the John Roberts Court, something that John Lewis had warned against and spoke out against when it happened. A resurgence of a kind of crude, racist rhetoric emerging from the woodwork in the Trump years that he spoke out against. Even before the Trump years, there was an incident when they were trying to pass Barack Obama's health care plan, when Lewis and others were marching over to the Capitol building and were spat upon and called racial epithets, in a way that John Lewis hadn't seen happen in many years. So he was worried about going backward, about losing the gains that had been attained. But he was also not one of these people who was given to saying, oh, nothing's changed at all. We're the same racist country we always were. He believed there had been real progress, and he was trying to fight to uphold that progress.
In terms of the life of John Lewis, you mentioned it briefly there. I want to go back to the beginning. Certainly, I only experienced the second half of his life. He'd lived for 40 years before I was born, at least. He was born in Pike County, Alabama, in 1940. What was life like for Black people the year he was born, and what was Pike County like in that very rural area?
It was a very difficult life. His parents had 10 children. They were at first sharecroppers, and then they scraped together enough money to buy their own land, which, they took great pride in, and they were able to provide for their family and send first John Lewis and then some others to college. But it would not be accurate to say even they were middle class. They worked hard on the farm, picking cotton, pulling corn, peanuts. They worked second jobs. His father as a bus driver, his mother as a washwoman. Uh, so there was real hardship and economic deprivation. And then, of course, on top of that, or really interconnected with that, was this very oppressive, rigid system of white supremacism. Today sometimes we use white supremacism to refer to anything that's racist, but that's not really what the term means. The term means a regime, that's sanctioned by law as well as by custom, in which whites are at the top, blacks are at the bottom. Blacks are expressly forbidden from all kinds of, both job opportunities, but also public accommodations like, going to the movies or the drugstore. And John Lewis would experience these things. When he went with his brothers and sisters to the movies in the town of Troy, they had to go up in the balcony while the main seating was reserved for whites. John Lewis loved to read as a child, and when he tried to get a library card, he was denied because of his skin color. He mounted a little protest with other friends and siblings and cousins, a kind of early indication that this was someone who was not going to accept this Jim Crow system passively, that he was going to challenge it.
Describe.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask if you can describe his family lineage. How much did he know about their time in slavery, and how did that inspire him later in life?
Well, he did have a large family, many of whom lived around him. His mother's family name was Carter, and they called the general part of Pike County Carter's Corners because there were different family members with different plots of land in the area. So he knew grandparents, even great grandparents growing up, and they were, a living link back to those ancestors who had been slaves. So it felt very proximate to him. It was very near. Later in life, he learned, and I was fortunate to get all the research materials for this. So it's all there in the book. Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard professor who does the Finding Your Roots television show, found that John Lewis's ancestors who had been emancipated, just after the Civil War, that among the first things they did, or his great, I forget how many greats and their grandfather did, was to go to register to vote. And so it's, you don't like to say, well, that's in the DNA, but clearly that desire to take advantage of his newfound liberties was something that, John Lewis himself would come to share.
Were you able to find clues in his parents themselves and how they either inspired him or paved the way for him to become someone who would strive to be successful?
I think so. I mean, on the one hand, he really had to break with his parents because, like a lot of African Americans who grew up in those circumstances, um, the natural thing to do is not to fight the system. That takes great courage. It means risking your life, your livelihood, the livelihood of your children. And the much more normal human thing to do is try to provide the best you can for your family under these difficult circumstances. So John Lewis's activism was something that at first, they worried about. They didn't, the thought of him going to jail, even if it was going to jail for a good reason, was deeply upsetting to them. For them, they wanted him to stay out of trouble and do his best to get an education and get a good life for himself. But in other ways, I think you can see some of the sources of his activism and his principle, particularly in their commitment to the church. His mother, in particular, a devout woman, and John, as a boy, was a churchgoer, a lover of the Bible, which he read. I mentioned, he just loved to read, and the Bible was kind of his first book. He became a minister even as a teenager. And then, even at 14, 15 years old, was inspired by Martin Luther King to become the kind of minister who would not just preach, but use his pulpit and use his position to try to improve the life of Black Americans around the South.
Yeah. So, I wanted to ask about, we're going to get to Martin Luther King in 1 second, but I just want to ask first about John Lewis and his favorite books. How did reading and this idea of being surrounded by literature help him form this worldview that ended up being the inspiration to so many people?
Greetings and salutations. My name is Tanisha. I am the host of Wellness Through Reading. This is a podcast dedicated to keeping reading a daily habit as a form of self-care. On the podcast, I give tips and tricks on how to keep reading daily. Also, I give out great book reviews of books that I'm currently reading that you can add to your TBR list. We post episodes every Wednesday. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so that way you stay updated when new podcast episodes are uploaded. And as always, I wish you, my listener, good wellness and good reading.
I think it's a theme you see in a lot of peoples and cultures, and in the African American community. It's a theme in Frederick Douglass's autobiography, sort of how literacy and reading was a path to liberation. I think for John Lewis, in the first place, as I said, it was reading the Bible and the sense of human equality that he discovered in the Christian Bible. Um, but it was also reading more generally. He read about he loved biographies of, famous Black men and women, whether it was Booker T. Washington or George Washington Carver. He got a little older. At his school, he would read the African American newspapers. There was a whole bunch of papers like the Pittsburgh Post Courier, I think it was called, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Chicago Defender. He would read these in his school library. Um, he also loved poetry, and there was a poem. I pretty much opened the book with the poem called Invictus, which is a sort of 19th century Victorian poem um, that he would recite as a boy around the house, and it eerily, uncannily sort of presages his own life story. It talks about, under the bludgeonings of chance, I am bloodied but unbowed. It's about a man determined to remain captain of his own soul and of his own fate under adversity. And somehow or other, John Lewis took to that poem as a young boy, and it became a model, or it spoke to qualities that were in him that we see develop in the Freedom Rides and Selma and all these bludgeonings that he endured in his pursuit of equality.
How did he first become aware of Martin Luther King, who I think is about 10 years older than him or so? I think maybe 11 years older.
That's right.
What are the first exposures that someone gets, or that he got to him? Just, someone who's older than him, but not like not like a long-standing figure in American history. This is someone who's also paving his way, just as John Lewis is starting to pave his.
Right. And Martin Luther King emerged as a national figure as quite a young man, while still in his 20s, with the Montgomery bus boycott, which, as I hope your listeners know, this was this very dramatic and groundbreaking movement in the segregated city of Montgomery, Alabama, to have blacks ride the buses and public transportation on an equal basis with whites. So they no longer had to sit at the back of the bus, famously. And this campaign kind of gripped the attention of the country. John Lewis followed it again in the newspapers and on the radio. But he also, I think even a little bit before that, had heard King on the Montgomery, Alabama radio station that his family listened to. It was a sermon he heard one Sunday that just enthralled him. There was something about King's voice, his message, his ideals that just immediately spoke to John Lewis. And then one other story, after a year of Bible college in Nashville, Lewis decided he really was missing his family and wanted to go to Troy State near home, but it was all white. So he just wrote a letter. He didn't know King at all. He wrote a letter to King asking for help in getting admission to Troy State. King and Ralph Abernathy and Fred Gray, his lawyer, invite Lewis to Montgomery, where they say they'll support him in this lawsuit, but they need his parents' support too because he's under 21. And they remind John Lewis of all the things that could happen. It could face retaliation. The parents could face retaliation. They could see their credit at the store dry up. There could be violence. And when John Lewis goes back to the farm to ask for his parents' help and starts describing some of these things that Dr. King has told him, he sees the look on their face and knows immediately they're not going to do it. This is not their way. They do not have that fire in the belly that John Lewis has. Ironically, though, he goes back to Nashville, and that's precisely when a lot of the ferment happens in the civil rights community there that leads to the great sit-ins of 1960 that help bring about the desegregation of Nashville. So those who would be inclined to look for a guiding hand could see perhaps a happy irony in the result of that first fateful meeting with King.
And I do want to go, of course, get to Bloody Sunday in a moment here. But I also want to ask how important the religious path was for him. So many of the civil rights leaders have Reverend before their name. He also takes a religious path. How did that help shape these folks' ability to fight and hold people's attention and public speak in certain ways that the rest of society simply is just not capable of?
Right. Absolutely critical. Part of it was institutional. So you always see the church as, a hub, a headquarters for these local movements, whether it's in Nashville or Montgomery or Birmingham. It's these activist ministers whose resources, whose networks, their congregations become, the people who fight for this. But it's also the ideas that King represents. He's far from the only one, a strain of Black Christian thought that is called social gospel. The idea is that the teachings are not just that about theology and being saved by the Lord, but they're about applying the teachings of Christ as they interpreted them to the current day political struggle, specifically over segregation. And most important, it's then fused, going back a few decades. King was far from the first to study Gandhi and incorporate the ideas and examples of Gandhi's nonviolent struggle in India. And this really becomes an important set of doctrines that the social gospel ministers, again, in Montgomery, Atlanta, Nashville, bring together. And for John Lewis, it's that mix of ideas that he encounters as a young man, 18, 19, 20 years old, that to him holds the answers. And he holds to these ideas his whole life. Nonviolence, civil disobedience, the redemption that is available to all of us, and what he called the beloved community, again, a term that King and other mentors of Lewis used. The idea that we should aspire toward a society that resolves its difference not through violence, not through invidious distinctions based on skin color or other differences, but sees our common humanity. And again, up to his dying day, these were ideas and ideals that Lewis articulated, that he argued for, that he fought for. So those experiences as a very young man were truly formative.
I want to get to Bloody Sunday, but I just want to ask first, what sources did you use for this? I want to ask a little bit about the way you put this all together. Yeah. You interviewed so many people, and thankfully you were also able to talk to him. What were you able to, and how were you able to piece this together? And how did you rely on A, the public archive, and then B, the one-on-one discussions you were able to have with so many people?
Right. Well, it was a tremendous resource. And I was fortunate that when I started this, no one had written a biography of John Lewis. So there was a lot of material out there that had not been sufficiently explored. Some of it was in existing university archives, Library of Congress. I mean, I went to more than 40 archives, either in present or lots online now, video archives, newspaper databases. I have something like 3,000 or 4,000 individual newspaper and magazine articles now on my computer, and that was just invaluable in sort of piecing together the story. There are places I could do it like almost day by day. I also had the benefit. There was a man named Archie Allen who began working with Lewis in Nashville in the 60s, was a close friend and collaborator for 20 some years, who himself started a biography that he never wrote. And he amassed an enormous amount of archival material that he shared with me. And it includes oral histories that were done with John Lewis back in the day when his memory was still quite vivid, giving us kind of day by day, week by week accounts of some of these great moments in the civil rights history. And then, as you say, on top of that, I interviewed, I think it's something like 275 people, many of them multiple times. And so where the paper record was silent, where there were questions that I had, I could ask. I talked to people from the movement, some of John Lewis's mentors back in Nashville, James Lawson, a Nashville divinity student at the time who just died last summer at 94. But I was able to interview him. I was able to interview Andrew Young, King's lieutenant, who remains alive at, I think, 92. But then I also interviewed his staff, his colleagues in Congress, people he worked with in Atlanta in the years in between, friends, family, all kinds of people who knew him, to kind of get this panoramic sense of the man. And I think, having been a journalist before I became an academic historian, I think when historians or biographers are able to use multiple sources, both the human sources that interviews give you and the archival sources, that's how you get kind of the richest, fullest picture of a person and all that he or she has done.
What were you trying to fill in with the interviews that you just can't get from the articles?
Well, there's a lot. Sometimes it's the texture of things. Sometimes it's stories. One example, a lot of his staff, this is in the congressional years, would tell me stories about how much John Lewis loved children and talking to school groups, or when friends or constituencies would bring young children to the office, how Lewis was the kind of person who would like sit down on the rug and play with them, how they would find Lewis was late for a meeting with executives from Georgia Gas and Electric, only to hear voices echoing off the marble in the hallways and know that Lewis had stumbled across a school group and was giving them an impromptu history lesson on the civil rights era. So when you get the flavor of life in his office, when you get the sense of, his relationship with his wife, Lillian, who's an important part of the story, someone whose story really hadn't been told before this book, and a key part of his ascent as a congressman and public figure. All of those things, that's not stuff you're going to find in the minutes of meetings, or even New York Times articles. You really have to go to people who were there, who experienced it, who knew him.
Was it hard to write about someone who recently died, as opposed to, like, let's say Martin Luther King, who unfortunately has been dead for like 60 years? He's recently deceased. How did you keep emotional distance from Lewis, given, he's been lionized by so many people of today's generation, so that you could step back and make sure you were fair in everything that you wrote?
Yeah, it was a challenge, I'll admit. I mean, I was and remain an admirer of John Lewis, and I think people will see this as an admiring biography. But I was also determined not to write hagiography, not to write the life of a saint. John Lewis has been called a saint. In 1975, Time magazine had a cover, "Saints Among Us," with Mother Teresa on it. And one of the other people in the article they featured was John Lewis. This is kind of long before his, congressional election. But John Lewis was human, and he had flaws like the rest of us. He did things he later regretted. He disappointed friends at times. There were people who had criticisms of the choices he made and the paths he pursued. And I felt I had to include all of that because that's part of who he was too. And in a way, I don't think it does anyone favors to present an absolutely reverent portrait of anybody, because that's not human nature. Human beings are complex. We all have flaws and weaknesses. So I really tried to, do what good historians or biographers or journalists do, which is to kind of keep whatever biases might be there in check, to question them, to listen to people who had something different to say and make sure that those attitudes and comments were reflected in the book. And so I think readers will find that, again, while it's an admiring portrait, they're also seeing a well-rounded John Lewis in all his dimensions, one who did many great and even, certainly did things that most of us could not hope to or could not imagine ourselves doing, the heroism, the courage, the selflessness, but who also at other times acted as human beings do.
How was he in person?
Remarkably humble and self-effacing. I mean, I don't think that should be a surprise to people who saw him in any sustained way. He was just someone who, as celebrated and accomplished as he was, remained, he kept a self-conception of himself as the little boy from the farm, as one of his aides put it to me. One time a staffer told me he met the Queen of England, and he came back to the office sort of wide-eyed, like, can you believe, like, I met the Queen of England, this kid from Troy, Alabama. And so when I met with him the first time, it was kind of peak John Lewis, just before he had done the Super Bowl coin toss. He did the coin toss with Andy Young in Atlanta. And then the next day, after I met with him, he was going to the Oscars to introduce Green Book for Best Picture. So he had become this cultural icon. And here he was taking time with me. I was explaining to him why I wanted to write this biography, and he gave me his blessing to do it. But he was just a very kind of simple, plain-spoken man. It was hard to imagine that here I'm sitting with this guy who the Super Bowl audience and this Oscars audience are about to watch and get excited to see. He just seemed like a regular person.
You've written a book about Richard Nixon. I want to ask, what's in the public? What do we know about what Nixon thought of John Lewis? How aware of Lewis was Nixon, and what did he say about him?
I have not seen much, if at all, of what Nixon said about Lewis. I did learn quite a bit about what Lewis thought about Nixon, which, as you can imagine, was not too admiring. Going back to 1960, John Lewis's activism, as it's dawning, is the time of the Kennedy-Nixon election. And John F. Kennedy, he was criticized fairly for moving perhaps too slowly on civil rights, but he also made it clear in that election against Nixon that he believed in the sit-in movement. And he says a line that Lewis himself would later use, that sitting down is the new form of standing up for your rights. And he endorsed the sit-in movement. He endorsed civil rights. And this helped a lot of Black voters, many of whom had voted for Eisenhower in the previous election, the Republican, swing over to the Democratic column, even though the Democratic Party in the South remained the party, committed to white supremacy. And Nixon, I guess I should say, really had a hard time coming out for civil rights. Interestingly, I think privately he was, and in the 50s under Eisenhower had used a lot of at least moderate rhetoric. But Republicans were now eyeing inroads in the South. And Nixon, being the political animal that he was, did not want to lose those votes. So he ended up kind of taking a mealy-mouthed stand in the 1960 election. Then, of course, during Watergate, the Vietnam War, Lewis is a sharp critic of Nixon. Nixon does not seem keen to renew the Voting Rights Act. So just so listeners know, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, a historic piece of legislation, but it had to be renewed. These days, we renew it for 25 years at a time, but then it was every 5 years. So in 1970, Nixon's looking for ways to kill the Voting Rights Act, and Lewis, obviously does not look well on that. So they have some pretty stark there in the early 70s.
Describe, if you can, let's get back to the action of this book here. Describe, if you can, how John Lewis gets drawn to Selma. I was just, as we're sitting here, I just pulled up a picture of John Lewis, kind of falling to the ground and covering his head. It's just a remarkable image, and it is so illustrative of what so many people were going through, A, that day, and then B, for the decades before. How did he get drawn to Selma? And then, if you can, just describe the day itself and this moment that he became known for probably more than any other reason, over the next 4 decades.
Right. Well, the Selma campaign is a historic one in the fight for voting rights. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, of which Lewis had been elected chairman in June 1963, got involved in Selma right around that time, 1963, a full year and a half before the famous Bloody Sunday March. And it was a tough campaign. There was really racist sheriff Jim Clark, who used his posse to kind of really brutalize the local politician. A judge, a white supremacist judge who was an ally, had forbidden the activists from gathering in groups of more than 3 at a time. That made doing anything basically illegal. So at a certain point in late 64, the local Selma group, called the Dallas County Voters League, that Dallas County is the Alabama county in which Selma sits, called in Martin Luther King and his group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This created a little friction with SNCC, because by now there was some rivalry between King's group and SNCC, not for Lewis, who continued to admire and look up to King and kind of feel he could do no wrong. But others in SNCC are upset that this bigger, more famous group is coming in to not quite supersede them, but they know they'll get a lot of the credit. Lewis, some of his old friends from Nashville are now working for King. And as things in Selma heat up, there's some terrible violence. A young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson gets murdered or shot, killed by local police. This brings out more demands for action and protest. And it's sort of the King group that decides to hold a march, that they're going to march all the way from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery, a multi-day trek that will galvanize and mobilize attention, much the way the sit-ins did, the Montgomery bus boycott did for their causes in their day. A lot of people at SNCC, though, don't want to go along. So Lewis is caught in between, and he says, well, look, I'm going to march on my own. And there are others from SNCC who march with him. So John Lewis is at the head of the line alongside a man named Hosea Williams from Martin Luther King's group. King, interestingly, does not come that day. There have been death threats. Some people are angry. They feel he's chickened out. But it's Lewis at the head of the line. And when they get to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is this sort of humpback bridge over the Alabama River leading out of town, they encounter Jim Clark's posse and a sea of state troopers. Governor George Wallace of Alabama, has had the state troopers sent in. And they tell them they can't march. The march is unpermitted and illegal. and they must turn around. Lewis and Hosea Williams ask for a moment to stop and pray. Before they can really even do their prayers, they are set upon by law enforcement who beat them, who whip them, who ride their horses over them. Many people are badly injured, sent to the hospital. John Lewis nearly loses his life. But the photographs of that horrific massacre, and also the videotape that some of the news stations have taken and are able to escape with and get on the air that night, is shown to millions and millions of Americans who, as we've seen in other contexts, respond to this horrific violence with compassion, and it helps stimulate the drive, most important among President Lyndon Johnson, to pass a voting rights bill later that year. So you really see a direct connection between Lewis's courage in encountering this state violence and the passage of one of the most important laws in American history.
How did he settle on this tactic of nonviolence and preach nonviolence despite being attacked violently?
It really is remarkable. A photo researcher I worked with found video footage, and I write about this in the book, never or barely ever seen before, because people didn't identify it as John Lewis in the video. But there he is in his hospital bed that very afternoon talking to reporters. And what's he talking about? Nonviolence. Like, despite having the living, daylight, but practically the life beaten out of him, he remains true to these ideals. As I said, it came from this early encounter with King and men like James Lawson, Kelly Miller Smith, these ministers who were already forging this doctrine of kind of Gandhian nonviolence and Christian social gospel teaching. And Lewis didn't give up on it. A lot of people in SNCC by 1965 were saying nonviolence had its day. It was good. It worked for the lunch counters. It worked for the freedom rides when we wanted to desegregate bus travel around the South. But now it's time for other tactics, other causes, other methods. For Lewis, it was a belief system. It was not just a tactic. And so for him, there was really no choice that if you march, and these troopers assault you, you do not fight back. I mean, not that he could have in that situation. And that those you trust that whether in the short term, sometimes it might be over the very long term, but that your experiences and the moral rightness of your cause will prevail.
There's so little written about John Lewis's family life. And I'm just curious, who did he marry? And they only had one child, who was the son of, is it Zernona Clayton?
Zernona Clayton was the
I'm
woman
sorry.
who
Yeah,
introduced John.
Lillian Miles is the wife. How did they meet? I guess it was at one of Zernona's parties, and then they only had one son.
One son. John Lewis, it's a bit of a mystery. He didn't date much for most of his 20s. People probably know the stories how these were young men and women kind of in the prime of their health and vigor. And you hear stories about, like, in the summer of 64, when everybody comes down to Mississippi for a big voting rights drive that summer, there's all this coupling up and a lot of romance and sex. And, there were many marriages that came out of SNCC, people who met in the movement and got married. John Lewis seems to have stood apart from that. He was married to the movement, as he said. But in 1968, he's at a crossroads. He's been more or less kicked out of SNCC in 1966 as it pursues a very different direction. It breaks from nonviolence, breaks from its interracial philosophy, and embraces what its new chairman, Stokely Carmichael, calls Black Power. That term means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. There are certain qualities or elements of the Black Power philosophy that I think were important and had a lot to offer. But for John Lewis, it meant SNCC was going in a different direction. So he's looking for his next move, and he's drawn to politics as kind of the next frontier where blacks, now that we have the Voting Rights Act, can vote, can elect other black members to office, and they can start to exercise black power that way. So, but he's casting about, and he meets this woman, Lillian Miles. They're introduced, as you say, by Zernona Clayton, who was in Atlanta, mutual friend who was in SCLC King's Group, also went on to do a lot in Atlanta media, and very, very accomplished woman. And Lillian is more middle class in her upbringing than John Lewis. She comes from Los Angeles. She's come to Atlanta to pursue a career as a university librarian. And she's really taken with John Lewis. He, in 1968, has gotten involved in Robert F. Kennedy's presidential campaign. Again, politics is going to be his new pursuit. Now, that spring is a tragic spring. He's with Bobby Kennedy on April 4th when Martin Luther King is assassinated. And Kennedy famously gives this beautiful, spontaneous speech quoting from Aeschylus to a crowd of African Americans gathered at a rally in Indianapolis. And then 2 months later, when RFK is himself murdered, John Lewis is also there, or he's upstairs in the Ambassador Hotel when Kennedy's killed in the ballroom. And these two assassinations right in a row, kind of coming on top of this sense of alienation from the movement of 2 years earlier, really leaves John Lewis at a low point. He goes in the hospital for exhaustion or depression. And Lillian, who he's now started dating a little bit, comes to see him every day, bring him the mail, bring him his newspaper, and very unromantically, from his hospital bed, he proposes that they get married. So later that year, they're married. Daddy King, Martin Luther King's father, officiates at the wedding. And Lillian, people told me, was really instrumental to the whole second act of John Lewis's life, his whole career in Congress and even as a city councilman before that. As I've said, he was very self-effacing, very reluctant to put himself forward. But she believed in him and helped him develop the confidence to say, yes, I could run for office. I could be a good representative. I can go for this. Her ambition for him was limitless. And she also could kind of put some of the steel in his spine when his own natural tendencies kind of might go in the other direction.
What did he find life like in Congress? Did he find it an effective place to make change the way he did the civil rights movement?
Well, yes and no. It was a different kind of change, and a different way of making change. The times were different. The need for or the public support for a kind of revolutionary set of laws like the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act had given way to, these more difficult, intractable problems of how do you ensure equal education, quality of schools, quality of health care for African Americans and whites or people of all races. These were the kinds of problems that we still struggle with that don't lend themselves to the simple moral solutions that the civil rights advocates promoted. We may have some thoughts of some things we need to do that we aren't doing. But John Lewis found that, politics is an arena in which you succeed by being pragmatic, in which you succeed by cultivating allies, making compromises, playing the long game, and people sometimes said, oh, he wasn't that much of a legislator, by which I think they meant he wasn't a policy wonk. He wasn't the go-to expert on drug policy or on housing policy, but he did legislate. And, as the years went on, people in Congress learned if you want a bill to pass, getting John Lewis's support is really critical, especially on certain things like civil rights or voting rights. So he actually became a fairly important power broker in the House, close to Democratic leaders, like Nancy Pelosi. And he came to use that power shrewdly and effectively.
Was he comfortable with this idea that so many have, especially towards the end of his life, but even in the middle of it? Was he comfortable with this idea of being a living hero? Was he willing to to understand that people had this view of him?
I think he did come to understand and accept it, and even try to use it or leverage it to continue to do good. Privately in his own persona, he didn't revel in celebrityhood. I mean, he would enjoy opportunities to meet certain people or, share a stage with Nelson Mandela. I mean, those kinds of things brought him, great pleasure and satisfaction. But, he also, people told me stories. Yeah, we'd see him at the Lenox Mall on Black Friday at the Panda Express in the food court. He remained a man without airs. He was the kind of guy, who someone comes to change a light bulb in his congressional office, and he's there holding the ladder, as the congressman. So he doesn't develop airs, even as he appreciates how he's seen. And again, I think in a way that good politicians do, tries to leverage or use his fame and reputation to push for good things, saying like, here, I'm John Lewis, I'm going to support this cause because I want to get it over the finish line.
There's a remarkable video of him being embraced by Emmanuel Macron, president of France. It's a really remarkable video. Macron sort of looks into his eyes and can't believe that he is in John Lewis's presence and that they're hugging. How did a foreign head of state develop such an emotional connection to this hero of the quintessential American movement?
Yeah. Well, it is interesting, the Macron story, because, I mean, he's one of many who, toward the end of John Lewis's life, comes to see Lewis as, not quite the stature of Martin Luther King, but someone like that. We have so few genuine heroes in our time, and I think John Lewis as a kind of living link to those triumphant years of the movement, and who fought for those ideals that we all, or most of us, recognize as our noblest ideals, but fought for them at a time when they were not so universally recognized. As time went on, that just radiated outward, and there were people in all parts of the world who came to learn who John Lewis was, to know about his achievements. And yeah, Macron's story is really quite touching, because he's not someone who has that same kind of deep connection. He's not getting this in American school rooms as a boy. It's something he sort of discovers as a man who's found a different path and a different nation to lead.
How do we take the lessons of John Lewis's life? And I guess I would just ask, what are the lessons of John Lewis's life as we look towards the middle part of the 21st century here, and we try and figure out what are the things worth fighting for and how do we fight for them?
Yeah. I'm always reluctant to distill history into lessons, because history is complicated, individual lives are complicated, and I think readers of this book, may find different lessons or different conclusions to draw. Some Some may see the political John Lewis that I describe later in life and feel that I don't think I would say he sold out, but they may feel like he became too much attached to the Democratic Party. And there are others who may say, no, that was a wonderful thing he did to help turn the Democratic Party into a vehicle for his ideals. And who admire that he was a man who could succeed as a young man in the arts of protest and as an older man in the arts of politics. And very few of us succeed at any one thing, but for him to be so good at both forms of social change is very impressive. I think, look, his ideals, as we've discussed, of nonviolence, of interracial cooperation, and his sort of racial universalism, seeing us as fundamentally the same under the skin. I think his ideals of seeing humanity in everyone, even your adversaries or opponents, and the hope that they can be redeemed. I think all of those things are things that he believed in that I would think, or readers of this book will take away and at least consider maybe ideals and values that are worth holding on to as we move ahead through challenging times.
I'm not sure where one goes from John Lewis. You've kind of reached the top here. You've written about Calvin Coolidge. You've written about Richard Nixon. Have you decided on what or who might be next?
I have not made a decision in my next book. I've got a few ideas kicking around, but they're still germinating. I'm one of those writers who takes time between my books usually. My books take me many years, and it's sort of like getting married. You got to make sure you pick the right person. When it just run off to Las Vegas. I'm still figuring it out, but hopefully we'll have a book that can be as or almost as rewarding as writing this one has been.
David Greenberg, the author of John Lewis, A Life. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Evan. Really a pleasure.
Check out the book and also his website, davidgreenberg.info. He's on the website formerly known as Twitter at Republic of Spin. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.